Hello, puppy. Hello. Whose dog is? Yeah, careful around the car. Bye. As any self-respecting car enthusiast knows, the 1980s and the 1970s were kind of a dark time for sports cars and car performance. But this Corvette right here was the first glimmer of hope after many years of darkness and 160 horsepower V8s that were just not up to the task of doing any sort of work at all, especially performance driving. The C4 Corvette started in 1984 with a measly 205 horsepower dog of an engine called the Crossfire, which was also known as the Ceasefire. Pretty funny joke, I have to say. And then it moved on and got a slightly improved engine with 260 horsepower, but it still wasn't really all that much. And then in the early 90s, the Acura NSX was on its way, and so was the V10 Dodge Viper. Corvette engineers were all of a sudden faced with the task of keeping up with the competition. A lot of people, including myself when I first saw this car at Cars and Coffee, would be forgiven to think that this is just a regular early 90s facelift C4 Corvette, because one issue with the ZR-1 is that it looks pretty much exactly the same as a regular standard C4 Corvette. Back in the 1990s and 1980s, car companies didn't really know how to distinguish their performance cars from the regular standard cars from which they were based. They didn't know whether to make the car look exciting and crazy so that people thought they were fast, or they're also worried about making a car that was too flashy so that the people that could only afford the standard model would be offended. Everything from the front of the windshield all the way forward is 1991 to 1995-96 Corvette. There's really no way of distinguishing this from a standard Corvette, well, except for the ZR-1 badge on the side of the hood. And moving to the back of the car, to the untrained eye, the only way you can really tell that this is a ZR-1 Corvette was to look for the roof-mounted brake light. Yes, this car is much wider than a standard Corvette, but it's very hard to tell. You really have to focus on it, and to be honest, it's better to have a standard C4 Corvette parked right next to it so you can see the difference in width. But on its own, from this angle, just looks like a regular Corvette, and that was one of the problems that made this car not sell as well as it should have. That doesn't really give it justice, because underneath the hood here is 375 horsepower, later upgraded in 1993 to 405 horsepower, which is, let's just do the math, at least 1 million more than the standard Corvette made back in the day. Not only does the ZR-1 have a massive performance upgrade with the engine, it also has other upgrades elsewhere like suspension and brakes, and like I said, much wider rear tires, which warrants a much wider rear end. So let's go back there. So when you think about Corvettes, the C4 generally is the one that people make fun of, the one that people don't like, because again, it didn't make all that much power throughout a lot of its life. All the C4 haters definitely shut up when you bring up the ZR-1, because the ZR-1 back in the day was an insane performer. Faster than a Porsche 911 Turbo in pretty much every performance metric that it was tested in, also did better on gas. But if you show up to a party and you're talking to a nice, fine lady and you tell her that you have a Porsche 911 Turbo, she's gonna think you're hot. If you tell her that you drive a Corvette ZR-1, she's gonna think that you're a weird hillbilly and she won't know what ZR-1 even means. So if you're planning on getting girls at parties, a Porsche 911 Turbo would probably have been the better bet. But the Corvette ZR-1, another thing, was much cheaper than a 911 Turbo back in the day. Just imagine what it would have been like owning a Buick Riviera, the same one that I reviewed last week, and seeing one of these things at the lights would have blown your mind, especially the way this thing could move away from the lights. From where you guys are sitting right there, that is pretty much the best way to tell that this is a special Corvette and not just a standard Corvette. And you're probably sitting there thinking, well, it looks like a standard Corvette, and that's what the problem was, see? When the ZR-1 first dropped in 1990, it definitely looked different from a standard Corvette. It had the standard Corvette from the 80s front end, and it had this exact same rear end. But then in 1991, the standard Corvette got a rear end that looks pretty much identical to the ZR-1. And that was quite a big problem and didn't really make ZR-1 owners happy, because imagine taking your standard Corvette, see, and then doubling the price of it, right? And then Chevrolet's immediately like, hey guys, look at this Corvette, that's the standard Corvette, that's half the price and looks exactly the same as the one that you just doubled the price on. You would not be very happy, would you? I like the sleeper aesthetic that this car gives off, but people back in the 90s shopping for Corvettes didn't really, and that's one big reason why this didn't sell. Those of you who have been longer-ish term viewers of my channel will know that I have already reviewed a C4 Corvette, an 88 35th anniversary edition, so we don't have to go too in depth on practicality or anything, but what I do want to show you is this ZR-1 came with a special box. And you're thinking, a special box, you say? That sounds interesting. When you get a ZR-1, it comes with this ZR-1 box. And you're thinking, what is in said ZR-1 box? Well, we open it and we get a special ZR-1 folder. So let's open our special ZR-1 folder and we see the original window sticker that this car came with back in 1991. And as I've said, the ZR-1 Special Performance Package costs nearly as much as the standard base Corvette did. The standard base Corvette was $32,000 back in the day. Adjusted for inflation, I'll flash it up on screen what it is in today's money. And then ZR-1 Special Performance was $31,000. Just $800 separated an option package from the actual standard Corvette price. And $32,000 for a Corvette was a lot of money to spend on a car back in the day. $31,000 was an inconceivable amount of money to spend on an option package. That ended up in a total vehicle price of $65,683, which in 1991 was a lot of money. Adjusted for inflation, that is at the bottom of the screen right now. But hey, $30,000 gets you this special folder with your own VIN number put on it. So that's a pretty easy decision to make. $30,000, but hey, you get a folder and a box. The rest in here is just standard C4 Corvette stuff. You have enough room for your lawn chair, your New Balance shoes, and your Corvette hat for when you go to Cars and Coffee. And when you go to Cars and Coffee, you can park next to a guy in a base model 84 automatic Crossfire V8 Corvette. You can park next to him, get out and look at him and be like, what's up? I got twice the horsepower. No big deal or anything. I'm just telling you, I've got twice the horsepower. When you're sitting next to there in your lawn chair, you can really make that guy feel how worthless he truly is. So we move from that to the driver's seat of the C4 Corvette ZR-1. Compared to the 88 Corvette that I drove couple months ago, this Corvette has a completely different interior. And is that a good thing? No, not really. Overall, the quality of the C4 Corvette wasn't as bad as the Corvette that followed, but that's not to say that it was any good at all. Lots of plastics and things that just aren't really screwed together. There's many different types of grays on this panel here. There is a wide panel gap here that I can fit my fingers in, but then it kind of just goes away down here on the door panel. It's a ZR-1. You shouldn't be sitting here nitpicking about the panel gaps unless you're one of the people that bought it originally and spent $60,000 back in the day on this car. Yeah, it's pretty reasonable to look at that and be maybe a little bit upset about that, but we'll move on. It is a completely different, more driver-focused interior than the 80s Corvettes, and there are lots of changes. Namely, the most disappointing to me is the lack of the really cool digital gauges that the 80s Corvettes had. Those are gone. What you have is a digital speedometer instead, and a traditional regular tachometer, traditional regular gauges. It's definitely not nearly as cool though. This steering wheel screams Chevy Cavalier to me, and I'm not that much of a fan of it, but hey, at least it has an airbag, which is cool. But that is not important. The ZR-1 came with a second special key. You take this key and you insert it into this keyhole below the radio and turn, and you activate full engine power mode, which activates more fuel intake things that I don't really understand how it works, but it activates more fuel underneath the hood that releases the full 375 horsepower. And when you do that, you get a warning in this little screen here that says full engine power, which kind of gives off check engine light vibes. But hey, it's cool, and it's a conversation piece. When you're trying to impress the lady in the passenger seat, you could say, "My darling, we are now in full engine power mode." Moving back from that, we have a 6-speed manual transmission. Gone is the 4+3 Doug Nash manual transmission with the weird overdrive button. This is more of a standard 6-speed manual. And then to the right, you have some pretty terrible cup holders that are really only good for small Red Bull cans. Definitely not 7-Eleven big gulps like a regular Corvette owner would want today. My advice is to close that so that you can reveal the special Corvette LT5 badge, which shows everybody that you drive around that you got the cool Corvette. It just says Corvette LT5, 350 cubic inches, 375 horsepower, just the standard specs, including comp ratio, whatever that means. Just before the center console, we have controls for the driver's seat and the passenger seat, and ride control, which you can set to Tour, Sport, or Performance. This car had adjustable dampers, I believe, and you could adjust the stiffness of the suspension, which for early 1990s was pretty advanced. That's something that we take for granted in modern cars today, but back then pretty much no cars had that at all. All C4 Corvette hardtops were Targas, so this top can be removed, but it's not as easy as you might hope given how easy it is to pop the roof on some cars. You actually need a little wrench and you have to unscrew some bolts, and we're not going to do that right now because it's cold anyways. Just know that this lifts off, and this top actually does fit in this back compartment here. Now it's time to talk about the most important part of the C4 Corvette ZR-1, and that is what is underneath the hood here. And to do that, we have to, of course, open the hood, which for a C4 Corvette is a bit of a different process than a standard everyday car, because this hood is actually a full clamshell, if you didn't know. Everything is normal about popping the hood up until the moment you pull the hood latch. And now what you have is a big, heavy clamshell to lift up. So let's do that. So technique is to go from the center. Oh my God, it's so heavy. Eventually, it'll hold. There we go. Once you finally have worked up the muscle to lift the enormously heavy hood, you reveal the LT5 V8, which has quite an interesting story. Now, General Motors was faced with the task in the 1980s to come up with a Corvette that was really special and really high performance, right? So they thought, well, hell, I don't know, maybe we should just make a V6 with turbos. That didn't work. Maybe a V8 with turbos. That didn't work either. So they thought, well, hell, I don't know, let's call up the British. So they ended up calling Lotus, which was owned by General Motors at the time. And they said, hey, you know your Etna concept car and the V8 that you've been working on for that? And they're like, well, yes, sir, we do. Well, hell, I think might be a good idea to throw one of those in a C4 Corvette. Yes, sir. I believe we could make that work. So they struck a deal where Lotus would design a dual overhead cam 5.7 V8 for the Corvette. There's more to it than that, but it was originally a Lotus designed engine. And then when they tried to fit it in the C4, they realized, well, hell, the C4's engine is loaded in a different way from the factory, and a dual overhead cam, much wider V8 isn't going to fit. Let's call up a boat company. Which doesn't make that much sense. So here's the scoop. Lotus designed this engine. General Motors got the money for this engine and had it in the Corvette, obviously, and had Corvette logos all over it. And Mercruiser, a division of Mercury Marine who makes parts for boats, actually built the engine. Kind of weird, and a lot of people don't know that, but what they ended up with was 375 horsepower out of a 5.7 dual overhead cam V8. The only Corvette to ever have more than one camshaft until the recent flat plane crank Z06. This must have been sacrilege for any Corvette guy. Like, well, hell, it's got 4 camshafts. What the hell's going on? Why are the British getting in engine design? It's supposed to have push rods because America. But this enabled that the Corvette could rev as high as 7,000 RPM. I think the red line was something like 7,500 RPM, which is very, very high for a Corvette. And it made 375 horsepower, at least in these early versions, 405 later, and 370 pound-feet of torque. It had a normal power mode where it was much more fuel efficient, and it had a full engine power mode where it unleashed everything that this engine had to offer. The LT5 also is one of the most beautiful engines ever put in a car. I mean, look at it. You can tell it just means business. It's nice and wide. It looks really big. And like I said, it did mean business. It beat Porsches, it beat Ferraris, it beat everything back in the day. This was a supercar engine. The rest of it is standard Corvette stuff. You can see the headlights, which for some reason are facing backwards this way. The headlights are pop-up headlights, but they rotate the opposite way because of aerodynamics or something like that. But I think they just did that because it looks cooler and it gives off a more high-tech vibe that the Corvette was trying to go after in the 80s when the C4 first came out. And the tire and suspension components are all exposed thanks to this clamshell design. So I imagine brakes, ball joints, things like that underneath here are going to be a lot easier to do than on a standard car. Now I think it is time to experience this engine in this car. So let's go. C4 ZR-1's always been on my dream car list, unbelievably. And this one has an exhaust on it, which makes the experience that much more enjoyable. Oh yeah. This is gonna be a lot spicier than that 88 that I drove, I can already tell. I'm gonna do it first in normal power mode and see how that feels. Now, compared to the 4+3 Doug Nash manual shifter that was in the 88 that I drove, this is a lot less mechanical feeling. It honestly feels more like a BMW transmission compared to what the Doug Nash was. It's a lot more of a conventional transmission this time, and again, that other transmission was so mechanical feeling that this feels like it's made of butter in comparison. Not to say that it's not notchy. All right, so I'm gonna pull in normal power mode real quick just to see how that feels. Slow in normal power mode, but it does feel like it has plenty of torque still, which is kind of funny. And you know, it's just nice to know that I'm saving fuel while I do that. It's not something that I think is important on a ZR-1, but you know, sitting in a C4, I absolutely love this hood view. You're all the way on the ground looking up at all the other cars. I mean, a 90s Sentra just passed me and that felt like a pickup truck in terms of how high it was. This thing sits right on the ground. And in terms of ride quality, right now I have it in sport mode and it's a little bouncy, but really is not that bad at all. The one complaint that I've had with the C4, at least the one that I drove before, is that it feels quite bouncy and creaks and rattles and makes a lot of noise going over bumps, and this car does kind of have the same problem. I'm gonna put it into tour mode, some railroad tracks, and that's really just testing the suspension. I didn't notice any difference between tour and sport, to be honest. So I think it's time to engage full engine power. So I flipped the key, little light turns on, and now I have 375 horsepower at the disposal of my right foot. We're about to find out what makes this LT5 so special. My immediate impression of that is that in a Corvette or an old American V8 sports car, you expect it to run out of breath at a certain point. This car just kept revving and revving and revving and going and going and going. There was no sign of it running out of power anytime soon. And it made such a colossal amount of noise. It didn't feel insanely fast as I was expecting. It did feel a little loose on the rear end though. It's pretty crazy the difference in feel that this car gives between its normal engine power with only half of the fuel injectors running and full engine power with everything running. It feels like a completely different car with a completely different engine. Yeah, I mean, this is easily supercar performance on 1990s standards. It's not the fastest car today, but it still has the capability to just really set your pants on fire. This thing is just regular driving. This thing is very easy. I found it a little bit difficult to get into third gear at some times, but I don't think that's necessarily the car's fault. I think that's more my driving. Oh, there's slight pull, I think. Check for police officers.
Here all the way.
This is the highest revving Corvette I've ever experienced. It feels like it revs to about 8 million, the way this thing just keeps going and pulling and pulling and pulling. Never runs out of revs. It revs up to 7,000 thereabouts, but it feels like way higher. Just I think the way the gearing is set up, as well as just the fact that you're not used to being able to do 7 grand in a Corvette. It's a totally different experience from that L98 and the previous Corvettes and the Corvette that was out when this came out. A couple years later, they dropped the LT1, which had 300 horsepower, and that also hurt the ZR1 because it narrowed the gap in performance, definitely. And then when they finally dropped the ZR1 in '95, they replaced it sort of with the Grand Sport, which was a more track-oriented Corvette, but that basically had the same V8 as in the standard manual Corvette in '96. And then in '97, the C5 came out with 340 horsepower, and they were planning on continuing the ZR1 into '96 with almost 500 horsepower. And imagine how cool that would have been, but it's General Motors, so for now, all we have is this. Oh my God, this thing is ridiculous. Oh yeah. They say never meet your heroes, but not in this case. I've absolutely had a blast with this thing. Just the way it never stops revving is insane. And then you remember it's a Lotus designed engine made by people who make boat engines and boat drives and things like that. Another thing is that it's a total sleeper too. To most people, it looks, hello officer. Hello officer, I've been driving within the bounds of the law, definitely. I didn't just do in a 40 zone or anything. Oh wait, I shouldn't disclose that on YouTube. It looks like a total sleeper. Most of these people probably think I'm in some 200 horsepower Malaise era Corvette, but I can beat all of them. You don't know that this is a special Corvette until you see the ZR1 badge on the back of the car as it's driving away from you. People with ZR1s treat them like collector's pieces, and they only have 1,000 miles on them, and they park them in a warehouse and under a cover. That's not what this car is made for. This car is made to drive and experience and make you smile, and it's not gonna do that sitting in a warehouse underneath a cover looking like a base model Corvette. You have to drive a C4 ZR1 to really get the point of it, get the whole experience. So with that, I'm gonna thank Brian for letting me do this video. I wanna thank everybody for watching. Like, subscribe, do all the normal YouTube stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye. We're about to find out what makes this LT5 so special. Oh my God. I'm so irritated that I missed that third gear shift, but
What happened?
wow, that was a very exciting experience. I'm just so pissed that I missed third gear.